Okay, well, let's make a start. Good afternoon, all, and welcome to this Law and Marxism book series event hosted by the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context. My name is Tanzil Chowdhury, a director of the Centre, along with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Evan Anopoulos. And we're delighted to be discussing the book, The Dialectics of Democracy towards a Socialist Constitutionalism, authored by Dr. Dimitrios Kivotidis. Dimitrios is a lecturer in the law school at Goldsmiths University, where he researches and writes on issues of public law, human rights law, political economy, and critical legal theory. He has published on the impacts of crisis legislation on fundamental rights, on the relationship between rights and social change, as well as on the relationship between constitutional law and political economy. His work has been published in ICON, Public Law, Northern Ireland Legal Quarterly, and Social and Legal Studies, and is also a member of the editorial collective of Legal Form, a forum for Marxist analysis and critique. We're also delighted to be joined by three other fantastic respondents. First, Fernando Quintana is a doctoral candidate, and full disclosure, he's my doctoral candidate in the School of Law here at Queen Mary, and he's researching on Pashukanis' Withering Away of Law thesis. Fernando has written for several publications, including Dissonance Magazine and Legal Form. We're also very happy to be joined by Dr. Maria Zanakopoulou, a lecturer at the School of Law at Birkbeck College. Maria specialised in public law and European public law, and is published mainly in the area of constitutional law and constitutionalism in the state and beyond, including her 2018 book, Reclaiming Constitutionalism, Democracy, Power and the State. And finally, we have Professor August Nitz from the University of Minnesota. August researches in several fields, including Marxism, political development, political economy, African politics, among other things. His book includes, among others, Marxism versus Liberalism, and the 2014 book, Lenin's Electoral Strategy from 1907 to the October Revolution of 1917. I also want to mention that the blog Legal Form will be publishing, I think, some of the reflections on the book by Maria and Fernando. So if you want to check that out after, you're welcome to. And of course, if you want to contribute, please get in touch with myself, Dimitrios or Eva afterwards. So the format for today's talk will be that Dimitrios will speak for about 15 minutes. Then each of our respondents, in the order in which I've introduced them, will respond for about 10 minutes. And I think then Dimitrios will be invited to respond to the respondents, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So over to you, Dimitrios.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to Tanzil and Eva for organizing the event. I am very grateful to them, and I am even more grateful to Maria, Fernando, and August for taking the time to read the book and for preparing comments for the discussion today. Special thanks to Maria for being here today because she's a bit unwell, and for August, who just made the trip from the United States. We are quite honored that he's here with us, especially on a day like today. Yes, I mean, this is my second monograph, but it's the first one was published during the pandemic. So this is the first actual book discussion that I have in person. So I'm really excited about this. And I want to share some thoughts with you on the book, and then take you through the contents of the book before I give the floor to the speakers. I'm going to start with something that I didn't come up with. So Maria was very kind to share with me her comments, and she made a comment that the book is partly a work on constitutional theory and partly work on political strategy of the left. And I found this a very accurate description of what the book is about. But I also understand that this may cause confusion as to the field that this book intervenes in. So, as I understand it, this is a work of public law, precisely because it is about public power. Okay, and I think that this is the connecting bit here, the notion that connects constitutional theory and and political strategy. So public law is about regulating public power, about regulating state power. At least this is what I tell my students in the constitutional law module. And state power is not abstract. Its exercise has distinct class and other characteristics. So this exercise of state power primarily functions to reproduce social relations, social system that relies on exploitation, domination, and relies from a Marxist perspective on what we call extraction of surplus value. As Tanzil said, I've done a lot of research on crisis legislation, especially focused in Greece and the European Union. And what I understood from my research is that whenever you see the words economic growth, competitiveness, flexibility, this all translates essentially to profit making, to ensuring conditions of profitability, ensuring that wages can remain low so that corporations can profit from the extraction of surplus value. And this profit making can only take place if it is protected by the state's armor of coercion. So this is where state power fits with political economy. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to go beyond the narrowness of the liberal viewpoint, beyond the liberal notion of constitutionalism. So constitutionalism, to those of you that are not familiar with constitutional law, is a notion that translates into limiting government by constitutional law, limiting government by fundamental law. So it's a manifestation of liberalism, in other words. Liberalism meaning government limited by law, constitutionalism meaning government limited by a fundamental law. And a notion that does not appear in the book, but I've started using a lot since I completed this manuscript, is this idea of market constitutionalism. And this notion refers to aspects of constitutions and constitutional law that ensure the reproduction of these conditions of profitability for capital, and these favorable conditions for major corporations to multiply their profits. Now, the most common example that is used in the literature is the European Union. You all are familiar with the four freedoms of the Union, the fact that there's a whole constitutional structure that supersedes nation states, seeking to create an internal market, so seeking to create favorable conditions for capital to move across borders. But the EU is not the only example. In the UK, we have the Internal Market Act. We have legislation on labor rights, labor law that enables the exploitation of the labor force. We have legislation on the OBR, so there is work on the economic constitution of the UK that takes us through all these characteristics by Professor Tony Prosser. And in the United States, we have, for example, a decision, Citizens United case, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, which interprets, so the Supreme Court of the United States interprets the US Constitution and specifically the freedom of speech provision to allow major corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money, huge amounts of money to influence the political campaigns. And I think this is key to understand the developments and what happened, what transpired a few hours ago and a few months ago, and what keeps happening in the US. So this is part of this notion of market constitutionalism, which is another way of saying liberal constitutionalism, essentially. So what I'm doing in the book is I try to explore the alternatives to this liberal or market constitutionalism. And in the alternatives, in looking for alternatives, I use this notion of socialist constitutionalism, and I try to distinguish this notion from social democratic constitutionalism. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So I treat this notion of social democratic constitutionalism as an aberration, as part of liberal constitutionalism, linked to the model of the welfare state. And I try to show the limits and how, in attempting to reproduce incompatible principles, with a focus on socioeconomic rights, but also reproducing the main pillars of capitalism, it always ends up in failure because at some point, one element has to give way, either protection of socioeconomic rights or the protection of capitalism. So I'll return to this later on. So I'm using this notion of socialist constitutionalism as signifying a search for alternatives, alternative institutional forms that would accommodate a different kind of power, a different kind of class rule, essentially working class power or workers' rule. And this idea follows from the recognition of the historical failure of what we call bourgeois parliamentary institutions, liberal parliamentary institutions, to lead the transition to socialism. Now, I approach this notion of socialist constitutionalism in a broad way, but I focus on the book on one of its aspects, which is the idea of democracy. And initially, I was planning to write on the idea of rights too, and explore this as a part of a socialist constitutionalism. But the project was, so I was getting carried away. The project was turning into something enormous, and I left that for the future. But stay tuned because there might be a second part to this work in a few years. So I'm focused on the idea of democracy, and the question is, what does it mean to fight for democracy in the context of capitalism? And there is a key theoretical point to understanding the book. So this is a quote from Karl Marx, and this is a fundamental contradiction that Marx identified with regards to liberal democratic constitutions. And the contradiction is this. So the quote says, "The classes whose social slavery the constitution is to perpetuate, the proletariat, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, it puts in possession of political power through universal suffrage. And from the class whose all social power it sanctions, that is the bourgeoisie, it withdraws the political guarantees of this power. It forces the political rule of the bourgeoisie into democratic conditions, which at every moment help the hostile classes to victory and jeopardize the very foundations of bourgeois society." So this is the quote. And I found this a very interesting quote because it sets out a main contradiction. How is it possible for the majority of the population to have political power formally, only to be subjected to the dominance of a minority, of a propertied minority? How can democratic forms accommodate social inequalities and increased exploitation and mass immiseration? So I try to approach this from a Marxist perspective, and there are several studies about Marxist studies about the capitalist state. And what helped me understand the function of the capitalist state is this idea that it always tries to balance two contradictory tasks. One is to ensure the profitability of capitalist corporations, and the other is to ensure social legitimacy. So these contradictory tasks are always, let's say, functioning, operating to transform the forms of the capitalist state. And for the first part of the book, I try to explore the different mechanisms at play that sustain this contradictory relation. So I focus on what Gramsci called the hegemony with the armor of coercion. Okay, so the combination of ideology and repression. I focus a lot on this idea of false consciousness and this idea that democratic forms, democratic principles, democratic institutions in capital society cultivate a fundamental logic of assignment, okay, that we as voters assign the task of government to our representatives. Instead of actively participating in how the government is run, how the economy is run, we assign this task to our representatives in parliament. And this is reflected in slogans like Tories out, for example. I mean, this has been a slogan of the Labour Party for years, since I remember. Get the Tories out, that's enough. If we get the Tories out, everything will will be bright. So developing this logic of assigning this concessionary logic, this false sense of ownership, this false sense of sovereignty, and reducing democracy to the right to vote in parliamentary elections. This leads to a passive acceptance of the status quo, to disengagement from democratic practice, from trade union activity, from localized action, from social movements. It also leads to a lack of belief in social change, to an idea that resistance is futile and there is no alternative ideology. And especially with regards to radicalized social movements and social strata, presenting the state as susceptible to social change and to change from within, and not as a class mechanism, as a class institution that needs to be smashed and replaced with new institutional forms of democratic power, has a very adverse effect on these movements. Now, ultimately, if all else fails, there is a crisis of hegemony or representation. If the political system crumbles and there is no faith in the parties, there is always resort to violence. So the book talks about it when it discusses the constitutional safeguards, the state of exception or constitutional dictatorship, martial law, as we know it here in the UK. Now, while we're on the issue of power, I want to share with you something that does not appear in the book. I had intended for the book to open with a quote from Jack London's The Iron Heel, which a quote that I believe captures the essence of what the book is about. Now, don't ask why this was not included, perhaps later on when we have a beer together. So in the relevant scene from the book, Ernest, the socialist protagonist, speaks in a dinner that is hosted by a group of capitalists. And the discussion revolves around the issue of power. And this is what the protagonist says. By the power of our ballot on election day, we will take your government away from you. To which the capitalist replies, what if you do get a majority, a sweeping majority on election day? Suppose we refuse to turn the government over to you after you have captured it at the ballot box. And the answer of the socialist, Ernest, is the following. And we shall give you an answer in terms of lead. Power, you have proclaimed the king of words. Very good. Power, it shall be. Now, this is the end of quote, but this is not an unprompted response. Earlier in this discussion, the capitalist, Mr. Wixon, has stressed the determinant role of power. He says, I quote, we will not reply to you in words. Our reply shall be couched in terms of lead. We are in power. Nobody will deny it. By virtue of that power, we shall remain in power. And later on, we have no words to waste on you. When you reach out your vaunted strong hands for our palaces and purpled ease, we will show you what strength is. In roar of shell and shrapnel, and in whine of machine guns will our answer be couched. We will grind you revolutionists down under our heel, and we shall walk upon your faces. So this is the end of quotes, and I think that Jack London here, even though writing 100 years ago, captures the spirit of capitalist rule. This is what state power is, and this is what bourgeois democracy is. And history confirms it. From the Weimar Republic in 1919 and the Freikorps murdering Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, to the fascist coup in Chile, to Greece in December of 1944, to Franco's dictatorship, the examples are too many. Democracy in capitalism is under the Damoclean sword of crisis, a crisis in legitimacy, a crisis in profitability. So, how does the struggle for democracy relate to the struggle against capitalism? In the book, there are two different parts. The first part deals with the question of the issue of struggling for democracy in the context of capitalist society, and the second one deals with the issue of struggling for democracy in the process of building a different socialist society. Now, I had a few words to say about the methodological points and the scope of the book, but I'll skip that because I know I'm running a bit late. So I will say a few words about the chapters, but I'm happy to say more about methodology and scope in the Q&A. So the first chapter of the book examines how the principle and the institutional forms of democracy have been and should be approached from a Marxist perspective or a dialectical materialist standpoint. So the main idea in this chapter is that democracy is not just an abstract ideal, but a political form of class society. So this is why I start with a discussion of the ancient Athenian democracy, and I move on to modern representative democracy, discussing more the US Republic and the establishment of the US Constitution. Then I move on to fundamental constitutional principles, discussing the idea of popular sovereignty, the oneness and the unity of the people, the idea of the free and general will, and as well as direct democracy and plebiscitary forms like referendums, in sustaining and deepening this false consciousness that I mentioned earlier. Then I turn to the classics of Marxism, so Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and their views on workers' organizations and their engagement with bourgeois democratic institutions. And in this part of the book, I draw a lot from Professor Dimitrios' important analysis of Marx, Engels, and Lenin's views on this issue. And I stress the need for independent working class organizations, the need for a workers' party that represents working class interests in these democratic institutions in order to combat this false consciousness. Now, in chapter 2, I try to set out the main parameters for a Marxist dialectical materialist analysis of democracy in contemporary capitalist society. So I set out the idea of imperialism based on Lenin's view and more recent work. And I try to set out that this system is based on the thirst and the manic pursuit of profit and the intensification of contradictions that lead to war, exploitation, and a manic attempt to escape this tendency of the rate of profit to fall, this manic pursuit of profit. So capitalism succeeds in reproducing itself as long as the organized working class movement lacks the mass and the dynamism, as well as the level of consciousness necessary to overthrow it. So I focus on this idea of repression, looking at the state of emergency and constitutional dictatorship, but also I make the claim that the main characteristics of constitutional dictatorship have become now permanent features of the liberal democratic form. Then I move on to concessionary forms, and I discuss the role of social democracy in reproducing capitalism, both in its institutional aspect, so the welfare state form that I mentioned earlier, but also the ideological aspect, so social democratic, reformist, instrumentalist use of the state, fed from the establishment of the welfare state, which promotes the view that the right to vote is the best and only way to exercise democracy. Chapter 3 moves this analysis forward, so I move on from social democracy to more radical theories like post-Marxism, radical democracy, left populism. So I review this literature based on the common rejection of all these currents of revolutionary Marxism and the elevation of parliamentary politics to an end in itself and a universal of parliament to a universal idea. Now, chapter 4 is a bit more specific about the developments in the digital society, digital technology, and how they also contribute to the reproduction of this false consciousness. I have written a lot about this, and I'm happy to say more, but I will not elaborate further on this at this point. And then, yes, so part 2 consists of 3 chapters. So this is where I engage with the notion of socialist constitutionalism and democracy, the idea of democracy in the struggle to build societies alternative to capitalism, transcending capitalist contradictions. So in chapter 5, I focus on social democratic constitutionalism. I deal with attempts to revamp the idea of socialist constitutionalism, but from a problematic perspective, at least from my standpoint, like the Law and Political Economy project that some of you may be familiar with. This is a polemic, more or less, against these approaches, a rejection of these approaches, not from a standpoint of ideological purity, but from a standpoint that A, puts emphasis on issues of class struggle and socioeconomic relations, and B, assesses the political implications of these theoretical views. In other words, who benefits from revamping social democracy as 21st century socialism or socialist constitutionalism? Now, chapter 6 is perhaps the most controversial part of the book, because this is where I defend the potential of two socialist institutions, namely the Workers' Councils, the Soviets, and the Workers' Party, to act as institutional carriers of the democratic movement. And it is controversial because these two institutions are understood in mainstream liberal discourse as the opposite of democracy. They are seen as essentially bureaucratic or authoritarian. And especially this ideological struggle for socialism as an alternative to the capitalist dystopia stumbles upon this well-worn argument of capitalist ideology, the idea that socialist institutions like workers' councils, like the party, like institutions for central planning, are a threat to individual freedom and lead to authoritarian systems ruled by democratic elites. Now, the way that I try to approach this and challenge this view is by looking at democracy as a process. And this process requires the constant building and the constant nurturing and creation of institutional forms of workers' democracy, direct democracy, representative democratic institutions as well, but also the creation of the conditions, infrastructural, educational, working and living conditions that will enable people to participate actually in the running and the governing of the state. So this process is not a spontaneous process. And precisely because it is not a spontaneous process, it requires the existence of institutional forms that mediate this transition from the false consciousness that is sustained and is born in capitalist society to the socialist consciousness necessary for democracy to operate. So approaching these socialist institutions from a Marxist perspective means assessing their role and place in the process of class struggle, instead of discarding them altogether. And I hope that this chapter contributes to challenging this solidified liberal viewpoint. And last but not least, chapter 7 intends to visualize a future beyond capitalism, a communist polity. And there I focus on the idea of representation, because one of the main arguments for the lack of direct democratic institutions is that in modern society, division of labor precludes the possibility and the existence of direct democratic institutions. And this is where I try to engage with the views of the classics of Marxism, not in order to prepare recipes for the future, but in order to provide, I believe that a debate on these issues is essential in order to revitalize this vision for alternatives to capitalism. Now, I think that's all. Apologies for running a bit over time. Thank you very much. I wish that many of you will encounter the book maybe when the price drops and it becomes more affordable. So thanks a lot.
Fernando, do you want to that off as a first responder?
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank all the organizers for putting this event together. I want to thank Dimitrios for, first of all, considering me. And also I want to thank you for your book. I think it's very timely. It may sound paradoxical, but when things are going the worst in the world is when revolutionary theory is most necessary, right? I also consider that the task of academia is not just doing abstract theoretical debates, but engaging in political issues, right? And I think that your book does an amazing work in finding the balance between the rigor of scientific critique and the braveness that it requires to undertake a project like this one, of considering what could be the alternative to the existing social forms, right? So I want to make 4 brief points. The first point I want to make has to do precisely with that, with the alternative, the difficulties and yet the importances of the discussions about the alternative. The difficulties are obvious. We live in a society that seems to be going, I would say, backwards rather than forwards. So thinking about a post-capitalist future doesn't sound very much in touch with the latest developments of political reality, right? Also, as you mentioned, we live in a social reality which is composed of social forms that have the objective function of preventing us from imagining alternatives. You talk about the mechanisms that generate false consciousness, right? That happens in the level of the voter, of course, but also in the level of social imagination, right? We are caught on what Marx would call commodity fetishism. So imagining alternative practices is not only subjectively difficult, it is objectively difficult, right? And yet it is very, very important. In the 20th century, I would say, the communist movement could avoid some of these discussions because you could just say, well, look at the Soviet Union, and the alternative did not need to be imagined. It was there, right? We are communists of the post-Soviet era. That means that not only there is no alternative visible anywhere, but also we have many experiences of how the alternative could not be like. And also, in many Marxist debates, scholars refuse to engage in the question of the alternative because it is said the struggles of the future shall build their own alternative, right? And to an extent, that is truth. It is purely speculative idealism to try and imagine, as you say, recipes for the future, right? But also, I wonder if trusting that the struggles of the future will produce the alternative ignores that also the struggles of the present need an idea of the alternative to engage in the popular energy which is necessary for popular mobilization. So in that sense, I think that your book engages with a crucial and yet difficult problem like that of the alternative, and I think it does it in a very good way. That was my first point. The second point I want to make has to do with one of the many mechanisms that you identify that helps, I wouldn't say solve, but stabilize the contradiction between democracy and capitalism, right? As you say, democracy is not an ideal. It is a political form, and more specifically, a political form of class societies. In the quote that you mentioned, Marx explains very well why capitalists require the republic to rule, right? The republic is the only social form that enables the processing of intra-class contradiction that is reconciled, for instance, industrial capitalists with finance capitalists, with rentier capitalists, while at the same time preserving their rule over the working class at large. So the republic is necessary for the rule, but at the same time, it is contradictory with the rule, because as you say, it puts political power on the hands of the people in the form of universal suffrage, right? And yet, this contradiction exists, and it is sustained by many mechanisms, one of which is ideology, right? You describe in your book ideology as false consciousness, and I agree with it. We can see that the representation that people make of their social reality and the ways to transform it under democracy is, of course, false in a way, right? Popular sovereignty, self-government are nice ideas, yet, but they don't really describe what happens when we analyze democratic systems. But my question to you would be if the notion of ideology as false consciousness is enough, or if maybe we could go further. And as I have said in other works, I think the notion of fetishism is very good in this sense, right? Because liberal ideology is false in an ontological way and in an epistemological way. But from a broader perspective, it is not false because it adequately reflects the conditions of a community-producing society, right? So we have the paradox that these ideological forms can be described as false consciousness, but in a way they are also true because they are an accurate representation of what happens in a community-producing society. So I wonder if the notion of fetishism could maybe take this analysis, which I share 100%, and take it further, right? The third point I want to make has to do with how you describe this dialectic of the struggle for democracy turning into the struggle for communism, right? I again agree with your analysis. Spoilers, I agree with pretty much. So your point is, or I think can be described as following. Real democracy cannot exist under capitalism, right? Because the social conditions for real democracy are contradictory with the private ownership of the means of production, right? So real democracy would be achieved if we subvert those conditions, right? That means if production is socialized, if we replace private ownership of the means of production with collectivization of the means of production and a number of more conditions that I will not go in detail right now, but you can tell where I'm going to. I'm pretty much describing communism or how I imagine communism, right? But the point is that if real democracy is achieved under communism, it is also sublated under communism, right? Because democracy is a form of political rule in class societies, right? But then communism is a classless society. So the struggle for democracy, for realizing democracy, kind of transforms into the struggle for sublating democracy, right? And when you describe that process, you go into describing that this has to do not only with institutional forms, but also with forms of consciousness, right? Because democracy is not just a number of formal procedures, it is also a way in which we think, in which we represent our social life, right? It follows that a post-legal, post-state communist society has not only different social forms, but also different forms of social consciousness, right? And at that point, you mention Lenin's discussion about the transformation of ethics, or rather, the transformation of individuals under communism, which he describes as this new ethical stance towards production, right? But when Lenin discusses this in The State and Revolution, my view, which I'm working on it right now on my PhD, so that may be wrong, and if you have recommendations, I would appreciate it. My view is that Lenin has a reductive notion of ethics, right? Because he pretty much talks about habits. It seems like he was talking about this new ethics of communism as a process of re-education. And of course, there is a dimension of re-education in here, but I think it may not capture everything, right? So I wonder if we could maybe look for a broader notion of ethics here. And I will make an additional point that I thought while you were presenting, because there is also a large discussion within Marxism about whether communism eliminates democracy or fulfills democracy. I think Dimitrios has a better way to put it, but the discussion is about like either or, right? Is communism the most perfect democracy, or is communism a post-democratic future, right? And what you say there is that it depends, of course, it depends on how we define democracy, right? And you put two examples, a narrow definition of democracy or a broader definition of democracy, right? The narrow definition of democracy, you put it in the words of Carl Schmitt, right? Democracy is that relation in which society can be divided into two fields, right? Enemies and friends. In that sense, of course, communism is a post-democratic society because we hope not to have enemies and just friends, right? Not in the purely subjective sense, but in the objective sense of a society that does not produce objectively exclusionary interests, right? In that sense, of course, communism sublates democracy. But in a broader sense, you say, if we take democracy like Aristotle took democracy, like in being part of the nature of human beings, or zoon politikon, if I pronounce it wrong, I'm sorry. In that sense, of course, then democracy is part of the future because it's part of human nature, right? I wonder if we can do the same operation in this discussion about ethics. Is communism also about the abolition of morality, like Marx says in the German ideology, like Pashukanis says in chapter 6 of the General Theory of Law and Marxism, or is it about the realization of ethics? So then again, I have that question, not the comments. And just one final point that I wanted to make is that chapter 4 of Dimitrios' book is very good because it discusses the digital transformations of the recent time and how it goes in favor or against democracy, right? And again, the reflection is brilliant. There is nothing inherently democratic or anti-democratic in technology. It has to do with the political economy of technology, right? And of course, the political economy of technology under capitalism is anti-democratic, right? But maybe we could think of ways to liberate technology from that specific use. And with this, I end my comment. You say that we should go back to Soviet discussions about technology to think of ways to reappropriate technology, right? But I also want to say that in the Chilean experience, there are a lot of good insights to be gained from the discussion about the CyberSyn project, with which Salvador Allende wanted to achieve not only a more perfect central planning, but also a more perfect decentralized planning. Notion that I think could be very useful to also rethink the dichotomy between bureaucracy and democracy. Thank you once again, Dimitrios, and thank you all for listening.
Maria.
Hi everyone, thank you so much, Dimitrios and guys, for the invitation. It's great to be here and very honored to be talking about my friend and colleagues Dimitrios' book. I'm a little nervous to do justice to the book because, you know, it's not every day that you come across constitutional analysis, which is about the contradictions of capitalism and how, you know, a constitutional system can supersede those contradictions, and, you know, analysis that, for example, sets as constitutional priorities elements like workers' control of production and like democratic decision making in the workplace. So it's great to have come across constitutional analysis that puts forward these ideas. What I will do is I will start with a couple of things that I find sort of truly admirable in the book. Basically, I'm going to tell you why you should buy it. And then I will say a thing or two that got me kind of reflecting and reconsidering things. My comment is going to be quite narrower than Fernando's, so I'm going to be narrowing down on a very specific sort of critique of democracy and so on. But let me start with what I found really commendable. So this is a constitutional text that sort of for once speaks about the toiling classes, speaks about the need for a mass worker party, speaks about revolution and building socialism, instead of, you know, the rule of law and all those other myths of kind of bourgeois democracy that constitutional analysis, especially in the UK, is rife with. And it does so unapologetically and sort of, you know, kind of steers clear of the very clean and sanitized language that we sometimes tend to use when we speak about bad things like Marx, Lenin, the class struggle, and of course, above all, communism. Like, where else are you going to find constitutional text that in a very nonchalant way says, you know, Lenin said that to get to the proletarian democratic form, we need armed workers to seize state power. So even just for this, the book would be commendable, but of course, the power of the book is not just in the way that it says things, but in the very argument that it puts forward. It speaks about the struggle for democracy as a necessary step in the struggle for the supersession of capitalism. And like Dimitris and Fernando were just saying, it, you know, proposes a strategy for social emancipation where democracy is not perceived in an abstract way, but as a precondition for building socialism, for building socialist relations of production, also a condition for the withering away of the bourgeois state. So for all these reasons, this is an excellent sort of read of current political and constitutional arrangements, but also a very useful guide on what is to be done. Now, one of the things that the book sort of does really nicely in the context of its discussion of democracy and its discussion about the rejection of revolutionary Marxism and the sort of deification of the parliamentary form and so on, is that the book sets right the situation where a few years back, shortly after the square movements in Europe, in Greece, in Spain with the Indignados and so on, you had a whole strand of kind of more radical academics who spoke about ideas of the multitude and kind of deified the multitude and spoke of the square multitude as a new kind of constituent power. And with hindsight, I think we can all sort of agree that these hopes were proven wrong. So the book criticizes these readings of the multitude as constituent power, and it does so correctly, of course, but also criticizes the movements themselves as actual incarnations of the multitude. And I think that in this latter criticism of the movements themselves, the book sometimes gets slightly carried away. So I'm going to say very little about some thoughts that this has prompted. I don't think that the square movement had a kind of sort of mass self-consciousness of being, this or the other thing. There were people there who sort of believed in the vanguard party and people who didn't. And there were people there who identified themselves as members of the working class and others with possibly sort of more fluid identities. And I think that, and this is my sort of main part of my main sort of reflection in the discussion. The book may have retrospectively kind of read the movements themselves in line with the narratives about the multitude that a bunch of academics had offered. And I kind of feel like this has been a slightly unfair criticism. So I don't see why the square movement had any different sort of or special or unique characteristic compared to other mass movements of modernity. It had more radical elements, obviously more reactionary ones, people with class consciousness, people without it, and so on. Perhaps the book meant that, the political powers that in the end managed to represent this movement, that they retrospectively imposed the identity of a fluid multitude, and not that the movement itself had adopted that. But again, if that is the case, so if it is like political powers such as Syriza, for example, that retrospectively imposed that identity on the movement, then, why was, for example, the one political power that is guided by its belief in the vanguard party, and I'm talking about the Greek Communist Party, why was it not there to struggle to represent this movement and win it over other political forces? I'm bringing in the Communist Party because, it's kind of explicitly referred in the relevant discussion of the book, but also, because squares in the book are discussed against the background of how we understand democracy, how we can use democracy as a stepping stone to socialist relations of production, and so on. So that's one part of my thoughts. The second part has to do with the concept of consciousness that we Fernando spoke about that, and you spoke about that. So social consciousness is a kind of central concept in the book. And I have to admit that at times I was a little confused when trying to navigate between different types of consciousness. So you've got, for example, full social consciousness distorting capitalist realities, at the same time as you have the inexistence of revolutionary class consciousness as a prerequisite for the development of a different kind of state power. And I got to kind of lost myself between the different types of consciousness that I'm trying to navigate your ideas. But just to take the discussion sort of back to the squares, there's a criticism there that the square masses lack consciousness. And that was manifested, among other things, in the fact that, I'm quoting, they were motivated by the immediate feelings of indignation against austerity, German hegemony, and EU neocolonialism, instead of a conscious analysis and determination to supersede the root causes of such symptoms. End of the quote. I don't see what the problem is with immediate feelings of indignation against austerity and why a movement, needs from the start to be bent on sort of superseding capitalism. In other words, can a movement that spontaneously revolts against an alien or unjust form of rule not evolve into an organized revolutionary movement? Must a movement sort of have embraced from the start the project of superseding capitalism? The book argues, you argue that initial spontaneity must turn into conscious organization. Of course, we cannot disagree on that. But if that is indeed the case, why is it again, for example, that the Communist Party was not there at the squares to sort of turn that initial spontaneity into conscious organization? So I kind of feel like spontaneity is treated in the book with a bit more suspicion than it deserves. And also, you know, spontaneity and accident were pejorative terms in the Soviet context as well. But, you know, ironically, the 1917 revolution was itself in many ways, you know, to a certain extent, an accident. Related to that, and I'm coming to a close, is the analysis of the square movements also kind of projects on the masses a need for self-sacrifice and self-denial, where, for example, it's stated that, you know, people would go there, protest, and then would go back home, continue with their normal lives and their normal sort of, you know, exploitative working conditions. And, you know, I thought, okay, so how realistically are we going to have conditions of continuous revolution if that, you know, if this is something that we actually want, if we see the revolutionary event as an interruption of normal life instead of a sort of continuation of normal life. So anyway, these are my thoughts, more or less, partly prompted obviously by personal experience, but obviously triggered by the relevant discussion in the book. That has been very, very thought-provoking for me. And thank you once again, Dimitrios, for an excellent read. Thank you very much.
I too want to thank Dimitrios for inviting me to be here. Luckily, I'm here for the historical materialism conference to present. We're having a book launch for a new book I've just completed with a co-author comparing Marx and Douglas, Frederick Douglass, during the Civil War. My project has been about bringing Marx, for the last 3 decades, to bring Marx back into the world of politics. I argue that he consciously made a decision to become active in. You have to take the 11th thesis of Feuerbach thesis very seriously, and that's what I've been about. Sometimes half jokingly, I say I'm trying to liberate Marx from the embrace, oftentimes a well-meaning embrace of political philosophers, and bring him back to the world of politics. And so I'm very pleased. I didn't realize how much you were drawing upon some of the things I've written, and I want to thank you once again for the article, running my article on Trump. I think it reads well after it was written shortly after the January 6th event, so we can come back and discuss that. But I really appreciate it. Yeah, you've got a lot going on here. I mean, I think there are a number of different projects. Can be worked up. All kinds of things that jumped out at me. You mentioned the diggers at the end, but it'd be fascinating to look at the debates that took place in 1647, the English Civil War, the Putney debates with the St. Mary's Church, and around the suffrage, the question of the suffrage and liberation and equality and so on, and democracy and so on. I think that would make for a fascinating. You can go beyond Hobbes and look at that real political world. So no, I really appreciate it. I think there's a lot going on here. Yeah, I want to focus on what you draw upon from the things I've written, especially my Lenin book, because I've made a self-criticism of the book. There's been a debate about the book within Democratic Socialists of America circles, and about independent working class political action. There's a big debate in the United States, as you can imagine, about the Democratic Party and whether or not should the Democratic Socialists of America, should they really break with them? Should they have their own candidates and so on? It'd be independent of the Democratic Party. This is a big debate. So my book has been used in that debate and so on. And I realized though that I needed to clarify some things. Sometimes the message gets lost in all of the details. And so part of my re-evaluation and looking at the book is to really get to the question which the Democratic Socialists of America, when they're looking at my book, really don't address. That is the question of what is the relationship between electoral politics for Lenin and actually taking of state power. That's missing in those discussions. So what I do and what I've done in this critique is to go back to Marx and Engels, and as you point out, that a very important self-criticism in 1850, the address of the Communist League. There are three major, I always like to take the opportunity to point out, there are three major self-criticisms, corrections in Marxist politics. And that first one is the 1850 address. The second one is the Irish question. He makes a correction in 1869, and it has an enormous importance for Lenin, and we can talk about it later. And the third one, which is related to what we're doing, the Paris Commune, the lessons of the Paris Commune, that is, the working class cannot employ the capitalist state to bring about socialist transformation. That's the preface, that preface to those three corrections. But the 1850 address, again, for people who haven't read it, you want to read it. It's only 11 pages. It's a self-criticism, and there was something. When I first read it, I realized that there was something missing, and I had a sneaking suspicion that indeed there was a concrete issue that was implied within that criticism, and I found it buried in one of the notes in volume 10 of the Marx Engels collected works. And I'd like to raise it. I've been using it in the last few months because my students, like a lot of people in the United States, have been torn about lesser evilism. And that's really what that debate inside the DSA is about, the lesser evil which you focus on. So I tell my students, I say, look, I feel your angst and the lesser evil being seduced by the lesser evil. But I said, you're in good company. You're in good company. The first time Marx and Engels participated in electoral politics, they got seduced by the lesser evil. We have the minutes there where Marx says he agrees with other people in the Communist League. We're too small. We can't run our own candidates and so on. We have to support the liberal Democrats. That's in the minutes. It's very clear. And I thought something like that was reality, but actually the minutes are there. So they do. Hey, Marx and Engels, they vote for the lesser evil, with the hope that the liberals there would pursue a Republican form of government, because again, there's the premises of the manifesto about the Republican form of government offers the best opportunities for the working class to be able to go forward to carry out its project. Weapons, the republic, bourgeois democracy, those are weapons, not an end in themselves, but a means to an end. So the liberals get in and they betray the working class in the German Revolution, and so they are too cowardly when it comes to actually pushing forward for a republic. And so the 1850 address, the March 1850 address, is a criticism, one of having suspended the party, the Communist League, and blended in, it merged with the larger liberal democratic movement. They're very critical of that. And as part of that critique, they're critical of the fact that they did not run their own candidates. They should have had their own program, had their own candidates, a Workers' Party in those elections. And in that criticism, Marx says he's responding to those who promote the lesser evilism and the criticism that you're splitting the vote. You're helping the reactionary get into office. You can imagine what's been going on in the United States for the last few months. If you're running your own candidates, you're undermining, you're making it easier for the most reactionary people to get into office. And so Marx and Engels, in that self-criticism, admit, yes, there are risks in running our own candidates. There are risks that the reactionaries are going to get into office. But their argument is that the advantages of running your own candidates outweigh the risks. The advantages outweigh the risks. And the advantages are, well, again, you get a chance to promote your ideas. You put forward a program. What do you stand for? This is what it's a positive lesson. Whereas lesser evilism is about what you don't want. It's most of what lesser evilism is about, what you don't want. So the importance of having your own program, you recruit, get out your ideas. And secondly, you get a chance to see where your support in society is, where your strength is, who's voting for you, and so on. Why do you want to know that? But the moment when it comes to making a revolution, for taking power. And those two kernels of wisdom, that really informs Lenin. You can't understand the Bolshevik perspective without understanding the importance of those two kernels of wisdom that Marx and Engels have equated, and at the essence of what the Bolsheviks did. And so in the book, yes, I have a lot of details, but there's so many details I failed to connect two important dots in the book. In 1906, during the 1905 revolution, Lenin lays out the perspective of using elections, but also making it clear that it's not going to be elections that's going to make it possible to take state power. It will have to be military means. Military means will have to be used. He states that in 1906 for the Second Duma. He's analyzing the election returns of the Second Duma election. In 1919, like you referred to that important 1919 article, the Constituent Assembly elections and the dictatorship of the proletariat. But in my opinion, the most important thing in that article are the 10 theses. There are 10 theses at the end. That's where Lenin makes it very clear. Yes, that elections that will not be the way in which we will take power. We will have to seize power. We will have to seize power. And elections themselves, he says very clearly, he says that big political matters cannot be settled by elections. It takes civil war. Big political matters are not settled by elections. And it's because of that, I was inspired. Now I've coined a term, so I'll run it by the audience, see what people think, especially, I call it voting fetishism. Voting fetishism, I define as the following. It's the mistaken belief that when we vote, we're exercising political power. No. When we vote, we exercise an important democratic right to register our preferences for either a candidate or a policy. Registering your preferences is not the same as exercising political power. It takes only less than a minute to vote. It is done very individually. No two things can be as foreign to exercising political power than something that is done individually and very brief. Very brief. Takes, again. So voting fetishism, once again, is the mistaken belief that when we vote, we are exercising political power. No, when we are voting, we're exercising an important democratic right to register a preference for either a candidate or a particular policy. And it becomes an ideology. To confuse the two, to think the exercise is ideological. I call it voting fetishism because I'm inspired, of course, by the term that the fetishism that you made reference to. But there's also a concept, a related concept that Marx and Engels make use of in the 1849 to 1850 assessment of balance sheets, parliamentary cretinism. Parliamentary cretinism is the mistaken belief that what takes place within the parliamentary arena is the end-all and be-all of politics. Lenin said, Lenin runs with that because he loves it. He quotes it all the time. But Engels and Marx both say, no, it's what takes place outside the parliamentary arena. That's where real power is. It's outside. It's outside. So it's this notion of parliamentary cretinism, commodity fetishism, and so on is what inspired me to come up with this term called voting fetishism. So I've been playing around with it. I've been trying to run it by my students, and it's fascinating to see the pushback I get, but it's been very helpful in me clarifying my ideas. Maybe I'll conclude. Monday night in my class, the day before the election, and a lot of very nervous students, a lot of anxiety in the room. and people were speculating on what the outcome of the elections. And I said, look, I don't know. I have no idea who's going to win the elections. But let me say what I am certain of. Let me say what I guarantee. You can quote me. I said, if Donald Trump wins the election and carries out carries out what liberals are claiming he'll do once he gets elected, what I call fear mongering. That's basically get people to vote for the Democratic Party. If he does that, I told the student, you'll get another chance to vote. And they said, what are you talking about? You'll get a chance to vote with your feet. That's the most important kind of vote. That's the most effective kind of voting that takes place. And with my students, I draw my own biography. And I tell my students the first time I tried to vote in the United States, they wouldn't let me because of the way I looked. The very first time I tried to vote. 4 years later, I could. What happened between that, in between? We had been in the streets. That's, for people, how do you get the right to vote if you can't vote? We had been in the streets exercising power. That's the project I've been on, trying to make clear that there's a difference between registering a preference and actually exercising power. And I'm drawing on Lenin. I'm simply putting this voting fetishism. I'm simply putting a label on something that Lenin said, and it's in that article, the 1919 article, in the 10 Theses. And by the way, it also applies to the Revolutionary Party. Yeah, just because you make a vote in a Revolutionary Party doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be carried out. This is why democratic centralism exists. That's the way in which democratic centralism is the way in which the majority gets its option to impose its will on the membership. So yeah, I'll let that suffice.
Thank you very much, Fernando, Maria, August, for your very thoughtful responses to the book. I will say a few words. So, starting with Fernando's comment. First of all, the difference between ideology and false consciousness. I think I wanted to avoid the Althuserian tradition and this whole treatment of ideology, and this is why I opted for the more Hegelian notion of consciousness, and which permeates the book. But I don't disagree with what you're saying. So the way I understand false consciousness is not as something that is merely an illusion, but something with objective presence and objective results in society. And I think had I known about the notion of voting fetishism, it would have probably featured heavily in the book, because this is what I'm talking about. And parliamentary cretinism is described, and it is part of the analysis. But yes, on the comment about democracy and communism, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, this idea about the realization of ethics and the role of ethics in a communist society is part of what was left outside the book when I decided to split and focus on democracy and leave the discussion of rights, ethics for a future project. So yes, I share these concerns. I think it's key to discuss communist society in terms of the ethical community. So I'm very interested in this, and I really hope that we keep working on these ideas together. And yes, last but not least, the cyber scene, of course. I think this is part, as I said, I'm keeping up with this part of the research, so I'm still working on ideas that I explored in chapter 4. So cyber scene is now on my radars, and I'll work on this more. On Maria's response, as I said, Maria was kind enough to share her response, so I have a few thoughts already penned down. So a central point of the book, even though it was not raised in these exact words, is that the success of any social movement is measured by how much it raises the consciousness of the masses and the consciousness regarding the need to transcend the capitalist system. So the existing conditions of increased exploitation, mass immiseration do not necessarily lead to conscious resistance or struggle against the factors that lead to this. In fact, they very often lead to the opposite. So passive acceptance of the situation, solidification of conservative reactionary views, even for the people in the social strata that do not benefit from the status quo. So the spontaneous, the immediate reaction to misery tends to be reactionary. And why is this the case? Precisely because of what I discussed, the false consciousness that is sustained by all these different mechanisms. And in the case of the square movements and the indignados, my question is, did this social movement raise the consciousness of the masses in these terms? And the answer that I arrive is, no, it didn't. So it failed in this respect. And the way that I answer this is by looking at the legacy. So objectively, the legacy of this event is translated into the 2012 elections and the rise of Syriza, first of all, and the Golden Dawn. And I will leave the Golden Dawn outside of our discussion for the moment, but the rise of Syriza was linked to the movement of the squares. And I don't think it was just retrospective. I mean, I can name out of my head right now at least 5 ministers of Syriza that were present in the squares, and they gave speeches and they influenced the squares as they were happening. So it was not retrospective, it was actual participation of these political forces and representation of the theoretical views in the squares. So I stand by my point that the squares were influenced by these views. And the crucial issue here is the demands. What were the radical demands of the squares? A constituent assembly, radical and direct democracy. Did these demands link the issue of democracy to capitalism? No. And I think Maria accepts that they did not. And this is precisely my point, that the Indignados movement, the Squares movement, cultivated a political view that restricted democracy to constituent assembly, to direct expression of the people's will, which is why the 2015 referendum was seen as the legacy of the squares. So the no vote in the 2015 referendum was interpreted as the legacy of the squares. So did the square movements raise consciousness? No. Are the political forces active in the squares responsible for this? Yes. And why is this crucial? Precisely because of false consciousness that was sustained by these political forces. Now, to be clear, I'm not arguing against the social movement. It's not the square movement that I polemicize against. I'm not saying that only a consciously organized by the party movement is acceptable. This would be sectarianism. Nor am I arguing against spontaneity. In fact, in the same chapter, I use Lenin's view that spontaneity is consciousness in embryonic form. But these spontaneous movements, as I said in the beginning earlier, their success will be measured by how much they raise consciousness. And yes, I think that's all. On August's comments, I think I agree. I just wish I knew of the notion of voting fetishism, and I think it very accurately describes some of the things.
To Jack, I think it really went to Jack London.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Yes. So yes, thank you very much, and I'm happy to hear any other thoughts, comments, or questions.
Okay, then, yes. So thank you to our speakers. So I'm going to open it up to the floor for any questions or comments, reflections that you might have about the book or about the presentation and interventions. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for the lovely discussion and the lovely book. Very fun to have the introduction. So what I want to ask is that to what extent do you believe that the separation of politics and economics inside the law, the unwanted separation, as the bourgeoisie parliamentary law tries to project it, kind of holds back the advancement of ideology, of class consciousness, by, I can give an example of my head. It is perfectly fine for me as a state to leave you starved to death, but it's not fine for me to take the freedom of assembly away. I mean, if I don't have a good reason. Yeah, so to what extent do you think that this, it's like constitutions in the national law maybe sometimes as well, do you believe that this plays a role in kind of hiding away the repressive nature of the state, which, I mean, I have another small question on this. We see many scholars kind of trying to push an agenda of, trying to hide away the powers of the state, the repressive power of the state, by substituting that with globalization, corporations, and they kind of, hide away the repressive nature and the necessity of the bourgeoisie class to have a state. So, yeah, this two questions in one. Yeah, thank you.
Dimitrios, I'll respond to that. I'll take a few more questions.
Sure, if there are.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. It's very nice to be here as well. Dimitrios is also a very good friend and colleague. I have multiple questions, but I want to raise two maybe for discussion. One, which, one more theoretical and one more practical to mirror a bit the divide of the book from the sound of it. Now, the more theoretical, maybe that's more something you address in the methodological question, and I'm asking just because of my own work as well. And it's, so you draw this connection between democracy and the class form of society. And you say hence that, democracy is not an abstract ideal, it's linked to class society. I was just wondering here, however, is it not also slightly transhistorical move? How do you define then democracy to find it that something is just specific? At which level of abstraction do we still have to go to say what? Is it the rule of the expropriating classes over the expropriated, no, the producing classes, is that, and if we define it in such sort of class terms, do we lose the specificity of capitalist democracy? To what extent this is important or not? And I think there are a lot of debates as well within law there. To what extent is law a capitalist social form? And to what extent is it a class form? Or to what extent is its connection to capitalism not about the class dimension only, but the commodity? In which case we could transhistorically trace the law a bit further, but we will attach it to commodity exchange rather than class societies. And so I'm just trying to understand how we make this move generally in Marxism, and whether you intend to transcend this dichotomy that many make sometimes between the pre-capitalist social forms and post-capitalist, and capitalist social forms and post-capitalist. And I think there as well, theoretically, it holds a lot for the temporality of the revolution, etc. How we think of social forms and how they sort of carry themselves out through history. So that's more my theoretical question. My more practical dimension, I think, is just the link, if you could elaborate on the link between chapter 2 and chapter 7. So imperialism and communists, constitutionalism. And whether you see when you discuss all those worker councils, etc., to what extent do you incorporate the imperialist element? Because of course, we all know that socialism in a country doesn't work. But I think in modern also terms, we have all seen how it's for the foreign capital, the international dimension of capital. The imperial dimension of capital is also very often what thwarts socialist attempts at revolution domestically. So how do you reconcile these two levels? Because that I think is, and obviously digitalization, but also this. And again, even in the US election context, it's funny, you see that expressed by some socialists, the opposite red one, by saying, that they want to appeal to that voting fetishism invertedly by saying we should all have a say in US elections because US elections are not about the US, they're about the globe. So I just wonder how you deal with the problem of Communist constitutionalism under imperialism.
Should I respond
Yes,
to those two?
yes, thank you. Thank you for the interesting questions. So, first on the separation of politics and economics, I think there are several ways through which I deal with this issue in the book. So there is obviously the focus of liberal constitutionalism on formal equality and the bourgeois legal form and the legal form in general has this distinct characteristic of formal equality, as opposed to the material inequality and the fact that the bourgeois constitution, the constitution of capitalist countries, does not care, or even if there are specific provisions, are not the essence and can be easily discarded about material inequality. So this reproduces the separation between the economic and the political. And I think what is key is putting obstacles to the unity that I think it was Lenin that more or less developed this as an idea, the unity of success for a revolutionary movement between the economic class struggle and the political struggle, or the struggle for the material needs, the everyday demands of the people, united with the struggle for state power. So this unity, when it is achieved, has led to successful revolutionary movements. And the liberal viewpoint seeks to separate this and seeks to keep and reproduce the separation between the economic and the political. And this is a key aspect of this idea of the market constitutionalism that I mentioned in the beginning. So market constitutionalism, you can see, for example, the Office for Budget Responsibility, okay? You need a technocratic body to tell us if the budgets are sustainable or not, okay? Because this is not what the people can do. So this is a manifestation of this separation between the political and the economic. This is not a political issue. It's not for the people to decide, okay? You don't have the expertise to tell us if a budget is sustainable. So we need the experts, and we'll go to the experts. And the experts will reproduce this, will present the view, or will give us the view that promotes general welfare. But guess what? 99% of the times, it's not general welfare represented in those views. Now, the point on globalization and shifting the focus of the state, I think it also relates to Eva's question. So this was when I started studying public law, and I decided that this is where I want to focus my research. It was a major difficulty. I mean, first of all, there was a lack. Now there are many more studies of public law from a Marxist perspective, but there was a lack even 10 years ago of Marxist approaches to law. There were plenty, comparatively at least, Marxist studies of international law, and this was precisely because of this focus on international organization, the European Union, this idea that the nation state has been more or less superseded. But then, with the crisis, the global financial, and ever since, the state is back. And I think it hasn't been an issue since then. Now, on Eva's question, this is very interesting because I think it touches upon discussions that we've had many times this year on the occasion of the Pasukhanis centenary, and this idea of the legal form, and whether the legal form, the source of the legal form is the commodity. Is it the capitalist commodity? So is the legal form specific to capitalist society, or is it the commodity that predates capitalism? So the law appears in pre-capitalist societies. And I think there is an interesting discussion and argument, and I think you can find traces of that in the book too, about democracy. So is democracy as a political form a characteristic of capitalist society? Is it a characteristic of pre-capitalist societies? Is the characteristic of class societies? Will it be superseded in a classless society? I don't have settled answers. I mean, I try to engage with this question in the book. I think my approach of democracy as a form of class society, not as an abstract ideal, came mostly from my engagement with Ellen Maxine-Wood's argument, because I saw that there was a risk there, and I state that in the book, of slipping, of perhaps approaching democracy as, and in this case, Athenian democracy, which was a class society. Ancient democracy is not an ideal to be applied everywhere, and it was only possible because of the exploitation and the extraction of surplus value by the dominated parts of ancient Athens, slaves, but not only slaves, the metics, and the subordinate social strata. So you can speak of Athenian democracy as an ideal that, for example, the American Republic did away with. You need to study these ideals, these institutional forms in their context, and this is what Marxist analysis is, a complete analysis of the concrete situation. So I think that methodologically, this is why I chose to approach democracy as a political form of class societies, not capitalist society. So I don't see it as specific to capitalism, but maybe similar to the legal form, you could make this argument that there are characteristics of the Republican form or the democratic form that make it, as Marx said in, was it the class struggles in France or the 18th Brumaire, I don't remember, that make it the ideal form of capitalism. Because it facilitates this reproduction of false consciousness, but also because of what Fernando said, it allows for the mediation of intra-class conflicts. So the state does not fall apart. The existence of political parties allows for these conflicts between the ruling class to be resolved without critically damaging the system of exploitation. Now, on the link between chapter 2 and chapter 7, that's also a very interesting question. There is a book that is forthcoming by Tony Smith, the professor from the University of Iowa, and he was kind enough to share the book with me. And this is another very important book because it is part of this process of increasing the normative appeal of socialism, of a socialist constitution, of alternatives to capitalism and the constitutions of capitalist society. And there, he does precisely this. So he comes up with an idea of socialism that's global, okay? And he comes up with different institutions that operate at the local level, at the regional, national, and international level. I do not aspire to do anything of that sort. I understand that, if we were to give a vision, perhaps that's a very interesting thing to do, and this is why I find Tony's book very important as an intervention. But maybe it is on the verge of preparing recipes for the cooks of the future there. I'm not sure. I think it is an important factor to take into account how this could operate on a global level in communist society. But for me, the most important questions at the moment is how you get there. And the struggling against capitalism, for democracy in capitalist society, and thinking about the institutional forms, even in one country, if a revolution happens in one country or more than one country, and it doesn't spread globally, because this is what the historical experience that we've had is that the revolution happened in a part of the world, but not globally. So I think that these are the most pressing questions. Of course, this doesn't mean that we don't need to take into account the international element and aspect of this. So yes, thanks for the interesting questions.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, I have some different thoughts or different thinking.
Of course.
I think part of the answer you gave after you did your first presentation. Do you remember what did you say at the end?
What did I say about social movements?
When you ended the presentation?
The presentation itself or the
Yeah, the
response?
presentation itself.
I I hope that you will encounter the book when it becomes affordable.
Yes.
Okay.
And often we forget to talk about the money. And the money often splits the classes or splits an individual. And his loyalty, whether to go with this political system or with that political system. And we tend then to talk about different political systems instead of talking about what makes us go to one sort of transition to one political system instead of holding our values and our thinking. But I'm not sure whether we have talked enough in every political system about the money. And if your book had been open access to everybody, and if all the knowledge in all the private schools and all around, if it's open access all around the world, we potentially would have a different ratio of people who are corporates or people who are very rich, 3%, 2% richer than half of the world. And we end up talking about political systems, but if parties because we may not have access to the knowledge that others have, and that becomes very exclusive. And then by also us talking about different political systems, we end up feeding the corporations of a variety. And eventually your book will become cheaper in, let's say, 6 months or in 2 years' time. But until then, we would all argue about different political systems. And there will be another book and another book. And people will continue to buy, and then we'll just follow the split within us. That's my take.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't really get this issue, but just because I don't know much about Marxism previously, that was very interesting. As I would like to remember seeing some of it. But I was kind of thinking about, like, if you think of like inequality reading, also because I felt like there were a lot about this even when you were talking about would it be the distillation of power between individuals and then could there be assembling it for like social movement that we're kind of seeing that today too. And we also see restructurations and like kind of self-organized communities which are kind of struggling with like state power and oppression. So I feel like there is also something about internationalism, and it's really like what we're saying at the end, is really kind of like recreating transcending the class in a way, because people are kind of uniting worldwide against a worldwide issue which is self-created by everyone. And so in a way, like the state is very present, but it's also kind of disappearing sometimes in the face of that issue. So I feel like it's a reading filter, which is really interesting. I think the insight is. And so I was just wondering how talked about this. This, I don't know, just maybe thinking so about the ideas that we developed, like politically developed political thoughts about, I don't know, libertarian communalism, sorry, and kind of different ways of using those institutional structures to kind of retake power and self-organize. But that in the cultural perspective, which also kind of tends towards this idea of maybe ideal future and ideal communist future, because there is also a question about imagination and what world and what conditions there will be. So I feel like there's a lot of things that can be explored in that and should have.
Thank you. Any more questions? If I could ask you one more, and then sure, we might have to wrap up. So I wanted to ask you a question, and this is kind of situating myself firmly within kind of British constitutional orthodoxy. And one of your chapters, you do talk about social democratic socialist constitutionalism. So this is a kind of left political constitutionalism. It was popularized, by the LSE, by the Fabians, all this kind of stuff. you identify the shortcomings in terms of and why that opens up the possibility of a socialist constitutionalism, which is informed by Marxist social theory. But I'm kind of because this is one of the things that I find when I'm reading the work of these kind of left political constitutionalists and speaking to them, because they're committed to the idea of repurposing various institutions of the state. And you talked in particular about Keith Ewing's current legal problems lecture on socialist constitutionalism, and he talks a lot about we need to establish this kind of ministry of labor where you'd have representation from the trade unions and all of that kind of thing. And in some ways that kind of chimes a little bit with what you're saying is a problem with with social democratic constitutionalism, which is this kind of assignment or deferment, because that's not that, right? Because that's basically saying that you're trying to give workers, or maybe representative workers, some power in the kind of infrastructure of the state. But the other way that I want to maybe think about where left political constitutionalism is a potential opening to kind of Marxist socialist constitutionalism is that it's to a certain extent very anti-law or anti-juridical, right? And Rob Knox talks about this in one of his in a paper that I can't remember what it's called. I think it's something called Labour and Anti-Juridical Constitutionalism. And so basically what he's saying is that what political constitutionalism could be, although he ultimately rejects this, as a stepping stone towards a kind of Marxist socialist constitutionalism, is this idea that we want to push back as much as possible the role of the courts, the role of the law or legal form, and the role of mediation through the common law, and leave it up to collective bargaining agreements between workers and bosses, right? Because what we had in the early 1900s and before is the courts intervening in those antagonisms. And there's a famous case, I can't remember, it's Tariff Vale, I can't remember. So anyway, so there's a kind of a smidge of political constitutionalism which is this kind of anti-juridical, anti-legal form, which is potentially a stepping stone towards what you're trying to begin to conceptualize in the 7th chapter of your book. Is that something that you think is a potential opening of a dialogue between the likes of yourself and people like Keith Ewing and a lot of the kind of LSE acolytes? Or is this something that is actually, in some ways, a kind of mystification in that we're pulled into the orbit and the allure of political constitutionalism, when actually we should be thinking about the things in the way that you are?
May I just ask one more?
Just because we've got 8 minutes left, and I wanted to reply to these 3 questions.
Would you be able to
Dimitrios, if you could maybe reply to these questions.
Yes. Okay. Now, first of all, yes, no, I think this question is, this comment is very crucial, and it touches a nerve because, as I said, it's my second monograph. I wasn't expecting it would cost £135 on hardback. So yes, I don't think writing this, I wasn't addressing people that can afford to pay £135 for one single book. Okay. Now, yes, this is how it works, unfortunately, and yes, I'll have to think about what can possibly be done. But yes, I mean, accessing research, accessing books, I think it's crucial to what we are describing here, and the access to knowledge. Now, on the question of the ecological reading, there is not, I'm afraid, so there is hardly any focus on climate crisis, but I don't think, and yes, I had prepared some comments on the scope of the book. I don't think that the interventions that this book makes cannot be are not applicable to other topics. So it is a major issue, and I want to start focusing on, questions of ecology, eco-socialism, and on all these different transitions, and see how I position. The most relevant chapter to this, I think, and the most relevant point that is raised in the book has to do with process of capital accumulation and how capital treats not just the social environment, but also the natural environment as a way out of this constant crisis. So this is the lens through which I would understand, at least methodologically, and I would approach this issue too. But yes, there's no explicit treatment of this topic. I think it would require a different kind of book to deal with this. Now on Dance's question, very interesting and very important. I think it has to do with the strategies of intervening as Marxist lawyers or Marxist legal scholars in the left constitutionalist debates, what you call left political constitutionalism. And yes, it also touches on the previous comment that, who is this book addressed to? I've had an offer already of translating the book and publishing it in Greece. I think, and it would be much cheaper. I think if this, is an opportunity, I would really like this to happen, because I'm sure that there is audience there that could, affording the book could, really make a difference. But I also think that here, even though the scope of the book is quite wide, being abstract, but I understand that there's no explicit references, save the part of social democratic constitution in the discussion of Keith Ewing's approach. There's hardly anything of strict relevance to Britain and the UK constitution. Part of the reason is that I only lately started feeling more comfortable, which is why my recent publications focus more the articles on the UK. But I wasn't that comfortable before that and while writing the book to deal with the UK. But I think, similar to that, some of the conclusions are applicable to the UK context. For example, Labour, the radical left here that always acts as a tail to Labour, the lack of an independent political carrier for the working class in the UK, this practice of, getting the Tories out and supporting any Labour candidate, the operation of the first past the post system, many characteristics of the UK constitution, I think the book can help explain or at least analyze. In terms of how we relate to the left constitutionalists here in the UK, I don't have an answer, I'm afraid. I mean, I am on good terms with some of them, certainly with Keith Ewing. I think it's worth trying to intervene as academics in the debates, because this allows us to promote our own views, but we need to separate the academic intervention from the political intervention. And the political, I think, what the book says is that you need an independent carrier. So yes, I'm happy to intervene in left liberal political constitutionalist debates, but to the extent that this translates to supporting Labour or translating academic into politics, I think there needs to be drawn a line there, and I think this is what the book stands for after all. So yes, thanks.
Okay, so I will maybe kind of push back on that and actually say I think you are, whether you intended or not, speaking to a lot of people thinking about the UK constitution and reading the book. It really is a kind of distinct intervention from the kind of strictures of the kind of left LSE Fabian political constitution. So I think it's though they may not be intended, I think it's an important contribution. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there. I'm going to thank Dimitrios and our three respondents.
For the last round of applause. So this is my book. but I want to share with you, Stavros. That Stavros also wrote a book. Stavros is in year 1. And his book is on the Monster Jam, which is an event with monster trucks. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but Stavros has written the book and he has illustrated the book too. Thank you very much. Yes, sorry.
No worries. Thank you very much all for coming. If you want to help yourself to some tea and coffee or some water, you can do. And I think we'll be hanging around maybe for a little bit.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you,
please
everyone.
keep up to date with the Centre for Law and Society in a global context and to find out about our future events. Thank you.
Thank you.